Before governments regulated money, before central banks existed, before laws tried to tame markets, there was something far more powerful shaping economic life: faith. In the ancient world, money was not neutral, it was moral. Every exchange carried ethical weight. Every transaction raised questions not just of profit, but of righteousness. People did not ask, "Is this legal?" They asked, "Is this just?" Religion stepped into the vacuum where formal regulation did not yet exist. It defined what could be owned, what could be charged, and what was forbidden. Wealth was not simply accumulated, it was judged. This mattered because early economies were fragile, markets were small, inequality was visible. Debt could destroy families for generations. Without moral limits, economic power could spiral into social collapse. Faith became the first stabilizing force. Religious codes told people how to behave with money long before states had the capacity to enforce rules. They defined fairness in trade. They condemned deception. They warned against hoarding during famine. They linked generosity to virtue and greed to corruption. Money was never just money. It was a test of character. In Mesopotamia, divine law dictated wages, prices, and debt relief. In ancient Israel, economic behavior was inseparable from covenant and obligation. In early Hindu traditions, wealth carried dharmic responsibility. In Confucian-influenced societies, economic conduct reflected moral standing. Religion did what markets could not. It set boundaries. It told lenders when to stop. It told merchants what was acceptable. It told rulers when accumulation became abuse. These rules weren't enforced by police or courts. They were enforced by belief, by fear of divine punishment and hope of moral reward. That made them powerful. Breaking an economic rule was not just cheating a neighbor, it was defying cosmic order. This created something remarkable: internal regulation. People restrained themselves not because they had to, but because they believed they should. Entire communities shared expectations about fairness, obligation, and mercy. Of course, these systems were imperfect. Abuse still existed. Power was still unequal. But faith slowed the worst excesses long enough for societies to survive and grow. And most importantly, religion framed money as something dangerous if left unchecked. Wealth was useful, but it was also corrosive. That idea shaped civilization for thousands of years. Before laws, before regulators, before economists, humanity trusted faith to do what markets could not, to keep money from consuming everything. And that is where the story truly begins. In the ancient world, lending money was not seen as clever. It was seen as dangerous. Interest, what we now treat as the engine of finance, was once feared as a force that could tear societies apart. Long before economists debated rates and returns, religions reached a stark conclusion: unchecked interest destroys communities. The reason was painfully obvious. Early economies were built on survival, not growth. Most people lived close to subsistence. When someone borrowed, it was rarely to invest. It was to eat, to plant crops, or to survive a bad season. Charging interest on desperation felt immoral, because it was. Religion stepped in where markets showed no mercy. In ancient Mesopotamia, excessive interest was restricted by divine law. Kings, acting as religious authorities, capped rates and periodically erased debts because they understood what compounding could do. Debt that grows faster than production eventually consumes society. The Hebrew scriptures went further. Interest was forbidden when lending to one's own community. Lending was meant to preserve life, not profit from hardship. A loan was an act of solidarity, not exploitation. Taking interest from the poor was treated as a moral failure, not a financial success. Christian doctrine inherited this fear. For centuries, usury was condemned outright. Lending at interest was framed as making money from time, something that belonged to God alone. The idea that wealth could reproduce itself without labor felt unnatural, even sinful. Islamic finance preserved this logic most explicitly. Riba, unjust gain through interest, was prohibited because it guaranteed profit without shared risk. Wealth was allowed to grow only through trade, partnership, and productive activity. Money was not supposed to dominate people. It was supposed to serve them. Across cultures, the pattern was the same. Interest concentrated wealth. Debt trapped families, compounding magnified inequality. Religions didn't oppose lending itself. They opposed asymmetry, a system where one side grows stronger, while the other sinks deeper into obligation. Usury bans weren't anti-commerce. They were anti-collapse. They recognized something modern finance often forgets. Debt is power. And power without limits eventually destabilizes everything it touches. By framing interest as a moral issue, religion slowed the accumulation of unpayable obligations. It forced lenders to consider consequences. It embedded caution into economic behavior. These bans were not permanent. Over time, loopholes emerged. Trade expanded. States demanded financing. Interest returned, quietly, creatively, and legally. But the fear never disappeared. Every financial crisis revives the ancient concern. When debt grows faster than the real economy, something breaks. Religion saw that truth long before spreadsheets did, and by declaring usury a sin, faith became the first system to warn humanity about the dangers of letting money multiply without restraint. Long before price charts and labor laws, societies faced the same question we still argue about today. What is a fair price? What is a fair wage? Religion didn't leave those questions to the market. It answered them. Across civilizations, faith taught that prices were not just numbers. They were moral statements. Charging too much was not smart business. It was exploitation. Paying too little was not efficiency. It was injustice. Markets existed, but they were not sovereign. In medieval Christianity, the concept of the just price dominated economic thinking. A price was fair if it reflected true costs, reasonable profit, and social stability. Price gouging during shortages was condemned as a sin, even if demand justified it. The same logic appeared elsewhere. In Islamic societies, traders were warned against hoarding to drive up prices. Deception in measurement was forbidden. Profits were acceptable, but manipulation was not. Commerce was honorable only when it preserved trust. In Confucian-influenced systems, merchants were tolerated but morally constrained. Excessive profit signaled poor character. Fair dealing elevated social standing. Economic behavior reflected virtue. Religion understood something markets struggle with. When prices float freely during crisis, they don't allocate efficiently. They inflame panic. When wages are driven purely by desperation, they hollow out societies. So ethics became regulation. Religious authorities preached against cheating scales. They condemned speculation on essentials. They warned employers that underpaying workers was an offense not just against people, but against God. These teachings shaped behavior even without enforcement. A merchant feared losing reputation more than profit. A ruler feared unrest more than efficiency. A community valued stability over maximization. Wages were expected to sustain life, not extract it. This didn't eliminate inequality, but it slowed its acceleration. It recognized that markets without moral limits tend to reward the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Religion placed a ceiling on acceptable behavior, not because it hated commerce, but because it understood human nature. Left alone, markets pushed toward extremes. Ethics pulled them back toward balance. Of course, this system was imperfect. Enforcement depended on belief. Hypocrisy existed. Power was abused, but the principle endured. Economics must serve society, not dominate it. Modern laws echo these ancient ideas. Minimum wages, anti-gouging rules, consumer protection, fair trade standards. All of them descend from religious concepts of moral pricing. Before regulators, before economists, faith tried to solve the same problem we still face. How do you allow markets to function without letting them tear society apart? The answer was never numbers alone. It was conscience. And for centuries, conscience did what laws could not. It restrained money by reminding people that profit without ethics carries a cost no balance sheet can measure. Religion did not just regulate money. It reset it. Ancient societies understood something modern systems often resist. Debt can grow beyond the capacity of a society to bear it. When obligations accumulate faster than people can repay, stability collapses, no matter how moral the rules seem on paper. Faith confronted this problem directly. Instead of pretending debt would resolve itself, religion introduced an idea that shocked later economists: forgiveness. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers regularly declared debt cancellations. These were not acts of generosity. They were survival mechanisms. When farmers fell too deeply into debt, they abandoned land. When families were trapped in bondage, production collapsed. Canceling debt restored the economic base. The Hebrew tradition formalized this logic. Every 7 years, debts were released. Every 50 years, during the Jubilee, land was returned, slaves were freed, and obligations were erased. Wealth concentration was forcibly unwound. Society was given a clean slate. This was not charity. It was systemic maintenance. Religion recognized that debt is not neutral over time. It accumulates power in one direction. Without resets, it turns free people into permanent dependents and markets into extraction machines. Debt forgiveness preserved participation. People could start again. Families could recover. Communities could remain productive. Islam carried this logic forward differently. While formal jubilees were not institutionalized, strong prohibitions against exploitative debt and encouragement of forgiveness were central. Charity, zakat, and debt relief were moral obligations, not optional kindness. Christian teachings echoed the same warning. The Lord's Prayer itself included the language of debt forgiveness. Spiritual salvation was linked to economic mercy. Letting go of claims was framed as moral strength, not weakness. These ideas terrified creditors, because forgiveness breaks compounding. It interrupts accumulation. It redistributes power. It reminds lenders that wealth is conditional. And yet societies that ignored this lesson collapsed repeatedly. When debt became permanent, revolts followed. When land concentrated endlessly, production fell. When obligations crushed the majority, legitimacy vanished. Debt forgiveness was not anti-economy. It was anti-entrapment. Modern systems still struggle with this truth. Bailouts are granted to institutions, not people. Defaults are moralized. Reset mechanisms are resisted until collapse forces them. Religion understood earlier. An economy without forgiveness hardens. An economy without resets fractures. An economy without mercy eventually devours itself. Debt jubilees were not idealistic fantasies. They were ancient risk management. And they reveal a final uncomfortable truth. The most powerful financial regulator humanity ever invented wasn't law or markets. It was the willingness to say enough. Long before finance had regulators, it had institutions. Not banks, not ministries, but temples, churches, and mosques. Religion didn't just set rules for money. It handled money. In ancient societies, religious institutions became the most trusted places to store wealth. Temples in Mesopotamia held grain and silver. Churches safeguarded donations and estates. Mosques managed charitable funds and endowments. These were not symbolic roles. They were operational. People trusted faith more than rulers. Kings could fall. Armies could invade. But sacred institutions felt permanent. That trust turned religious centers into financial hubs. They collected taxes, administered charity, issued loans, managed land, and redistributed resources during crises. In many regions, they were the largest landowners and employers in the economy. Temples functioned like central banks of food and credit. Churches acted as custodians of inheritance and capital. Mosques administered zakat and waqf systems that funded education, welfare, and infrastructure. Money flowed through faith. These institutions enforced economic norms not through force, but through legitimacy. A contract honored by a religious authority carried moral weight. Default wasn't just financial failure, it was spiritual disgrace. This reduced transaction costs long before economists named them. Trust replaced enforcement. Reputation replaced policing. Belief replaced bureaucracy. Religious authorities also mediated disputes. They settled conflicts over debts, wages, land, and trade. Their rulings were accepted because they were seen as impartial and sacred. This made them powerful. They could restrain greed when states could not. They could forgive when markets refused. They could redistribute without rebellion. But power came with tension. As economies grew, rulers noticed something uncomfortable. Religious institutions controlled vast resources outside state command. Wealth accumulated under moral authority rather than political authority. This created rivalry. Kings taxed churches, states seized temple lands, governments tried to nationalize charitable systems. Each attempt revealed the same problem. Remove religious institutions too aggressively, and trust collapses. Leave them unchecked, and power shifts away from the state. So, compromise emerged. Religion regulated money informally. States regulated it formally. Modern finance inherited this structure. Central banks echo temples. Charities mirror zakat systems. Trust frameworks resemble religious legitimacy. Even today, financial systems rely on belief. Belief in currency, contracts, institutions. Religion understood this first. It proved that money doesn't function on numbers alone. It functions on trust. And for thousands of years, faith was the strongest regulator humanity had. Not because it punished wrongdoing most harshly, but because it convinced people that economic behavior mattered beyond profit. That authority shaped finance long before governments caught up, and its influence never truly disappeared. Religion did not lose its grip on money, it transformed. As societies grew more complex, faith-based rules slowly migrated into secular systems. What began as moral instruction became codified law. What was once enforced by belief became enforced by institutions. But the architecture remained the same. Usury bans softened into interest rate caps. Just price doctrines evolved into consumer protection laws. Debt jubilees became bankruptcy systems. Charity obligations turned into taxation and welfare. Modern finance did not replace religious regulation. It inherited it. When governments began regulating markets, they adopted the same goals religion had pursued for centuries: prevent exploitation, preserve stability, and maintain social order. The language changed, but the intent did not. Central banks now manage what temples once did: stability of value, supply control, crisis response. Courts enforce contracts that once relied on moral authority. Regulators oversee behavior that religious leaders once condemned from pulpits. Even trust still matters. A currency holds value because people believe in it. A contract works because it is respected. A financial system survives because confidence remains intact. Religion understood this long before economics named it. And when that confidence breaks, modern systems revert to ancient instincts. Governments forgive debt. Bailouts appear. Rules bend. Stability is prioritized over purity. The cycle repeats. Every major financial crisis resurrects religious questions in secular form. Who deserves forgiveness? When is profit immoral? How much inequality is acceptable? When does debt become unjust? These are not technical questions. They are ethical ones. Religion framed money as a moral test. Modern regulation pretends it is a technical problem. But in moments of collapse, the mask slips, and values reassert themselves. This is why financial regulation is never purely economic. It reflects what a society believes about fairness, responsibility, and mercy. Ancient faiths did not hate money. They feared its power. They recognized that without restraint, finance destabilizes trust, concentrates control, and fractures communities. Their solutions were imperfect, but their insight was precise. Markets need boundaries. Debt needs limits. Wealth needs purpose. Modern systems continue to wrestle with these truths. And every time regulators intervene, cap rates, forgive obligations, or rescue systems, they echo a lesson taught thousands of years ago. Money cannot be trusted to regulate itself. Faith was humanity's first attempt to control it. Law became the second. The struggle remains the same, because money still tests virtue, and always will.